Welcome everyone to the commu model webinar. We're just going to wait a couple more people to join and then we'll get started. If you're just joining, we're just going to wait a couple more, 1 minute or so, and then we'll get started. Okay, as it's just gone through, I think we'll get going. So welcome everyone. My name is Courtney Mosley. I'm an Assistant Relationship Manager at Active Essex. Thank you for joining the commu model webinar today. This webinar is a result of behaviour change research that has been carried out in Essex by Britain Thinks. So before I introduce our presenters from Britain Thinks, I'll just talk through some functions available to use on this webinar. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see there is a chat box function. This can be used by panelists, it can be used by attendees to communicate with one another. So please feel free to use that throughout the webinar. But you will also see that there is a Q&A function as well. So we are going to have a Q&A part to the webinar, which will be close to the end. So please submit any questions you have throughout the webinar, and these will be picked up and answered by our presenters. So I think now that we are ready to start, I'm going to introduce Tom Brooks and also Lucy Bush, who are both from Britain Thinks, who will take us through the commu model research within Essex. So I'm going to pass over to Lucy.
Thanks, Courtney. I think Tom's just going to upload our slides, so I'll give him a moment to do that. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, thank you so much everyone for your time today. And we're going to be talking through the final report from the research we did, as Courtney introduced. We did some work in Essex amongst inactive people living in deprived areas in the county. We talked to them about physical activity. And this is the final report from that project. So I'll just talk through the different sections of the report. I'm going to go through the introduction and the context section, and then I'm going to hand over to Tom, who will present the barriers and typologies that came out of the research, and then he's going to pick up on the drivers of behaviour change, and I'm going to come back for the conclusions and the Q&A session at the end. So by way of introduction, just to sort of set the scene and let you know kind of what we were commissioned to do, what the challenge was for us. So this piece of work was rooted in the fact that 25% of adults in Essex are inactive, but that this rises up to 70% in deprived areas of the county. So we were asked to understand what are the drivers of that inactivity in those deprived areas. And we were particularly asked to use the commu model to both sort of structure the design of the research, but also to inform the analysis. So that meant that we were looking at the capability, opportunity, and motivation barriers and drivers to inactivity. And you'll see that we kind of make reference to the commu model throughout this report. Specifically, our objectives were to understand what people who are currently inactive see as the barriers to doing more physical activity. So what are the things that they recognise in their own lives that are stopping them from doing more physical activity? To look at the relationships between those different elements of the commu model, so capability, opportunity, and motivation. They don't operate in isolation from one another, so we wanted to understand how they interlink, what are the relationships between those different elements and how they influence one another. we also wanted to understand the circumstances or experiences that that drive people to have a perceived lack of capability, opportunity, or motivation. So what's going on in people's lives that that affects those different drivers and barriers, and then finally to understand what could be done to drive up physical activity by looking again at those different elements in the commu model. So you'll see that those words and those concepts come out throughout the whole report. And of course, the idea is that the findings from this piece of research will be used to help the LDP and other relevant stakeholders to inform strategies going forward. A quick recap on what we did, what our methodology was. So the project was structured across 3 phases. So and they were with the same participants. So we got to know them pretty well, and built up a rapport and with them, and got to understand their lives and the broader context of what was going on, as well as what was happening in terms of their activity or inactivity. We started off with a 2-week digital ethnography. So there were 30 participants in total who were onboarded onto an online platform, and we used this online platform firstly to basically sort of just get to know them and understand the wider context of their lives without going in hard talking about physical activity, but sort of understanding what else was going on, so we could understand where physical activity or inactivity kind of fitted in. And then in the second week of that online ethnography, we started to explore barriers to increasing activity levels, and this was structured around capability, opportunity, and motivation. So that was when we started to introduce the idea of activity and understand how that fitted into people's lives. So once we'd completed the 2-week ethnography, we did a series of deep dive interviews. So every single one of those 30 participants then took part in a one-on-one telephone interview with a Britain Thinks moderator. And these interviews were designed to reflect on what they'd been telling us in that digital ethnography, the barriers that they experience and so on. But we pushed the conversation forward a little bit to sort of dig underneath those barriers a bit more, and also to explore some potential drivers that might help them overcome the barriers that they'd already kind of discussed with us. At the end of phase 2, we held a workshop with the client team, and that was to kind of reflect on the things that we'd learned in those earlier phases, and then to brainstorm some content to feed into stage 3, which was a series of participant workshops where we sort of split people into groups depending on the types of barriers that they experienced, or on the type of or where they sort of lived in Essex. And this was very much about kind of understanding perceptions of their local areas. And we also there's an opportunity here to test some initial campaign materials, and we developed our understanding and our learning about what would help to encourage this particular cohort to take up physical activity, more activity. So I'm going to sort of kick off with just sort of an overview of 4 key findings, not to sort of steal Tom's wind, who's going to be talking through the detail of it, but this is to sort of help you navigate through what we're going to be talking about in some detail. So the first thing is that thinking about doing physical activity, it's a very emotional topic for people. It provokes deeply held negative emotional responses amongst inactive residents. The prospect of doing physical activity feels very intimidating and very far from where they currently are. When we ask them to sort of imagine the types of activities that might be suitable or appropriate for them, they tend to think of activities that require no skills, no equipment, so very easy kind of entry level activities, things that are relatively easy or low impact. So sort of the idea of being very out of breath or very hot and sweaty is really quite off-putting, and very importantly, something that has a social element, and we'll come back to that. But these are the types of activities that our inactive participants imagined as a way into doing physical activity. Secondly, then picking up on some of the elements of the commu model. So our participants typically identify opportunity and capability barriers, and the various ways in which they're interlinked as the key things that prevent them from being physically active. Time, especially, it's mentioned here, it's pulled out here because it was something that people kept talking about. But having said that, what we found was it was a lack of motivation that usually sits beneath those barriers and makes them seem even harder to overcome. So we feel that whilst those practical barriers, lack of time, lack of funds, etc., shouldn't be ignored, the focus really should be on tackling low levels of motivation in order to affect behaviour change with this group. So if we're looking at the commu model and those three different things, it's the motivation barriers that are the most entrenched with this group and that should be the focus of any campaign activity. Thirdly, so just sort of picking up on the barriers a little bit more, these can be deeply personal, and it's perhaps no big surprise to say it, but it's worth just making the case here with this data we have from the research, which is that inactive residents are not a homogenous group, and what we were able to do was to pull out some typologies that Tom will be talking to in a bit more detail later. And these correspond with the combi behavior change model. So we see there's a group of people who just feel that life gets in the way, struggle to find the time and energy to do activity. There are some who experience lack of funds, who feel they don't have the money to be active. There's another group of people who don't think that they're going to enjoy physical activity, see it very much as a chore, a burden, not something that they would enjoy doing. There's another group of people who tell us that they sort of lack energy to do something. Their lives are very busy, but also that they kind of, that they don't have the energy to put aside to do something like physical activity. And then finally, people who have sort of health problems that prevents them from doing physical activity, or that they feel kind of holds them back, is another group. So we'll be talking about those different groups in this report. And then finally we, our sort of where we got to by the end of this was that prompts and messages most likely to drive behavior change are those which make activity feel enjoyable, inclusive and achievable. Those are three really key words. So positioning activity as social, something you can do with a friend or with a group of people, highlighting that it can take a range of non-exercise forms. It doesn't have to be about doing exercise in sort of quotation marks. Activity takes all types of forms, and making everyone feel that there's an easy or realistic way into starting activity. That really emerged as a key kind of point, which is, what's the first step I need to take? That feels like a very big barrier to people. And if you can kind of make it feel easy and realistic just to make that first step, you've made huge progress with this audience. And just sort of and reassuring them that there is something out there that is well suited to them and their abilities. And that's the sort of the key starting point. So that's a sort of a run through of the key findings, and now we're going to go through the detail. I'm actually going to present the context section, and then I'll hand over to Tom. The data in this section is kind of drawn largely from the digital ethnography, where we were learning just about the context of people's lives and if and how activity or inactivity kind of fits in, and we heard stories and anecdotes from our participants telling us about what they were doing day to day, largely filled with kind of domestic chores and hobbies. So you can see there a kind of a chart which pulls out sort of watching TV and using a computer or a laptop, cooking, cleaning the house, playing with the children. All those kind of things are enjoyed by this particular subgroup in Essex. Interestingly, walking came out also as something that people were doing quite regularly. And we also noted that gardening, cycling and housework sort of cropped up when we were asking people what they were doing with their time. So, so some examples of activity in there as well. And it's worth sort of saying that we asked people to do complete this diary task. It made residents aware of some pockets of time in their day where they might be able to do activity. They were reflecting on those times, and in fact some of them kind of started to do a little bit of activity in those kind of pockets of time. Not everybody, but it was interesting to see that even just reflecting on what they did with their time did prompt some people. the broader kind of context piece, I think, and this is really important to note. I mean, obviously, everyone on this call is, very passionate about promoting physical activity and getting people moving. But for this particular group, doing more physical activity is actually rarely top of mind. They're not necessarily thinking, oh, I should be doing more. It doesn't feel like it's something that's lacking in their lives. It's not particularly top of mind. And as I say, actually sort of engaging with it on the online community, on the digital ethnography, it sort of, they made that in itself made them think, oh, actually, yes, I'm not really doing that much. I hadn't really noticed before. I'm just sort of busy getting with my life, and I hadn't really kind of even noticed that physical activity wasn't a part of my life. So I think it's just worth noting that they're starting from quite a different place, and it's not really necessarily kind of top of mind for them. Of course, part of the research was prompting them to consider physical activity. And when we did bring this into the conversation and start to ask about emotions and thoughts and feelings about doing it, we heard, people talking about feelings of guilt, powerlessness, and apathy. And you can see that it is, and quotes on the right, which sort of illustrate some of those deeply held feelings. It sort of prompted this sort of sense that, oh yes, I should be doing more. I feeling quite self-critical of low levels of activity, and evoking sort of feelings of guilt, but sort of at the same time saying, I don't really feel very motivated to change. So it sort of left people in quite a sort of quite a complex and negative emotional kind of space. And even then, once we kind of prompted people to consider physical activity, it wasn't always something that was kind of then on their radar. They just don't feel that they can incorporate it into their lives, or they tell us they're quite content with their current activity levels. They're not necessarily looking to change. So just worth bearing that kind of starting point in mind. We also put in front of people the recommended levels of activity from the government. And what was really interesting is that actually many of the participants thought that the levels would be much higher. So they actually, getting started can feel quite daunting for them, because they think that in their mind, they're sort of putting an active person a little bit on a pedestal. They think they should be doing much, much more than is actually required. And when they were learning about what the recommended weekly amount of physical activity is, they often felt that actually, yes, these guidelines are quite appropriate. If you break it down over the course of a week, it didn't feel too daunting, or even if, it feels like quite a lot to start with, you could kind of imagine how you might break it down and kind of build up to that. There are some nice quotes on the right. We can share the slides with you afterwards, and you can sort of have a read through those quotes. But, they were very much sort of feeling, inspired and a bit sort of excited by the idea that they weren't necessarily being asked to sort of do half an hour a day or something, which is what they thought it was. The exception to that, though, was people with long-term health conditions, who also comprised a proportion of our sample, because for these individuals, the guidelines did feel quite ambitious and often failed to kind of inspire or motivate them. And in particular, they pulled out the reference to vigorous activity, which often felt unachievable for them. And they wanted some inclusion of strengthening exercises, things that may not kind of, get you very out of breath or sort of be too vigorous, but are important for people who may be disabled or who have other conditions that means they're sort of less mobile. So they wanted to see some reference to strengthening activities in there as well. We also asked about the impact of the pandemic, and of course, whilst most of our residents were sort of not necessarily that active before it hit, there was an understanding and a feeling that physical activity has been even harder to start or continue even since COVID struck. And in particular, we've pulled out these three key themes. Firstly, around poor mental health. So the idea that, in the past year, several of our participants said that they'd been, struggling quite a lot with their mental health. And it just makes, physical activity or kind of motivating yourself to do something new or to do something a bit scary or, different, really does kind of fall to the bottom of one's to-do list. The second thing was just, actually, lockdowns and social isolation, all the things we've been through in the past year, just mean that, keeping active through everyday activity, walking with the kids to school or walking to work or whatever it might be, has been sort of cut out of the routine, and that's been hard to replace. And then finally, closures of gyms and pools and other facilities has made it harder for people to be active as well. So yeah, perhaps not a bit surprising there, but yeah, COVID has had quite an impact on that. So Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Lucy. So I'm going to talk through in this section the barriers faced by inactive residents, as well as our 5 typologies. And then the next section will focus more on the drivers of behavior change that seem to resonate with our participants. But to start first with a list of barriers that we put in front of residents in the first phase of research. When forced to choose from this list, typically inactive residents are pointing to opportunity and capability barriers as the key reasons why they're not able to be more active. And as Lucy mentioned in the first key finding, it's lack of time, which is very much comes up again and again in the different phases of research with this audience as being one of the key barriers to doing a bit more. And just under half of our sample chose not having the time to do more activity as one of the reasons why they weren't able to be more active. Worth saying, of course, that this is qualitative research, so these findings aren't statistically robust, but they do really indicate the state of mind and the approach, the spontaneous approach taken by inactive residents in our sample. And you can see that it's between 1/3 and a half of our sample who are identifying either opportunity barriers related to lack of time, or also cost, or capability barriers related to whether you feel physically fit enough to make a start, or whether you see yourself as a sporty person, as being the barriers that are most applicable to them. Interestingly, and we'll come back to this, but down at the bottom, with very few residents selecting them, are barriers related to not understanding the benefits of physical activity, or not thinking that the health benefits of activity are important. And we'll come back to why it resonates less with this audience a little later on in the next section. Despite this, however, despite having those opportunity and capability barriers as the ones with the highest incidence across the sample, when we move on to the qualitative deep dive interviews with the same participants, it is often motivation which emerges as a key underlying factor for this audience. Inactive residents who we heard from are already describing barriers as interlinked. They have a very strong spontaneous understanding of that. And many describe opportunity and capability barriers as exacerbating pre-existing or underlying motivation issues. So inactive residents typically describe of themselves the internal factor of low motivation, though they're not sort of a complete lack of motivation, but certainly low motivation levels as they see it. And then they also describe external factors that they're butting up against, those limited opportunity and capability barriers that we covered on the previous slides. And they feel that the former, those levels of low motivation, can make those external factors seem much harder to overcome, while butting up against those external factors can only exacerbate and make worse their low motivation levels. A couple of quotes on the right that really demonstrate that. Firstly, from a middle-aged father of young kids: it's hardest to join a class if you don't know what you're doing. It can be hard to join a class if you don't know anyone, and then you lack the motivation and the opportunity. And for a resident who, a disabled resident, she described feeling that even if she does feel motivated to go to the pool, she then may not be able to get in, have to use a winch designed for disabled people, and find that the temperature's not right for her disability. Then she'll really feel really down, and despite having the opportunity, her motivation level will again be exacerbated. I'll feel there's no point in going. We felt that across our data, however, we can split inactive residents into 5 key typologies, which map onto their primary barriers and whether they speak to opportunity, motivation, or capability. The first 2 typologies can be grouped under the heading of those who would like to do more. The first of whom, however, lack time, and they feel that life simply gets in the way, which is their primary opportunity barrier. The second group may like to do more, but feel that they lack financial resource in order to do it. Again, coming up against a primary opportunity barrier. A couple of other groups suffer more from motivation. And as Lucy said in the key findings, the first of those simply lack enjoyment of physical activity, and the second lack energy to do so at the end of a busy day, or kind of busy lives in which they're working and already on their feet quite a lot. And then the final typology, whose perspective we feel is a really important and distinct perspective, are those with long-term health conditions who feel that they can't do more physical activity due to a kind of lack of health and lack of the sort of external factors required to make activity easier for them. I'm going to talk through each of these 5 typologies on subsequent slides, and also give you a bit of a case study of inactive resident who fits into each of these groups, whose names have been changed to protect their anonymity. So to start with the life gets in the way typology. Unlike the other typologies, we found that these residents may actually have previously enjoyed exercise, and some express an intention of getting back to it and becoming more active again. Typically, however, they find that work or childcare lead to limited time, and that exacerbates the feeling that it's going to be harder for them to start again. This group, we found, felt that the pandemic and lockdown had been particularly challenging. They were having to spend more time on childcare, gyms had closed, their previous routines had been disrupted, but many described the imminent end of lockdown, near the end of our fieldwork period, as potentially an opportunity for them to become a bit more active again. And in our sample, these residents tended to be female, typically working parents of young children. A good example is Fran on the right, who actually used to be really active in her teens and 20s. She described doing dancing, kickboxing, and ice skating regularly, but that changed when she had her first child, which she found really hard to balance with working part-time. And for Fran, she felt equally that the idea of starting again felt more intimidating as a result of her time spent being less active than she used to be. The other group who suffers from opportunity barriers are those who lack the financial resource to do more. Typically, typically residents don't raise financial barriers at the sort of first point of asking, and you'll see that they were relatively far down the chart that I began this section with. Instead, it kind of comes out over the interviews and through spending a bit more time getting to know the personal circumstances of these residents. Typically, they are quite aware that there are some free or low-cost forms of activity that they could be using, but walking and running isn't for everyone. And these residents may feel that they're simply unable to afford the activities that might actually motivate them, whether that's going to the gym or taking part in a class. This is particularly exacerbated for parents who feel that they also need to take their children along, pay for childcare, or pay for multiple entrances to the swimming pool, for example. These residents we found were on low incomes, in insecure work, and again tended to be parents with young children. Susie is a good example. She actually used to be a member of a karate club, but now as a full-time mum who is unable to return to work due to the prohibitive cost of childcare, she feels that she can't afford the membership fees. We suggested to Susie some perhaps budget options for physical activity, YouTube tutorials or running, and she simply felt that with limited energy and limited enthusiasm for those activities, she was unlikely to start those without that sort of social element to activity. To move on now to the two typologies who suffer from motivation barriers, and starting with those who simply lack enjoyment of physical activity, we found that this phenomenon is typically comes from quite early unhappy memories of school sports activities, and that this typology are particularly averse to competitive sports, leading them to simply not see activity as something that's for them. Some of those we spoke to in this typology are actually quite happy with their levels of inactivity. They might have an awareness that they should be doing a bit more, but that in itself isn't really an effective motivation for them. Instead, what they want to see is having activity disguised or sold as something enjoyable, something that they can actually enjoy. And they are largely accepting that they probably won't get that enjoyment from exercise itself, but doing something social or doing something that disguises the exercise part of activity could be more of a motivation. We typically found that actually there weren't strong demographic profiles of these residents. Instead, they could be found across age ranges and family types. A good example is Ahmet. He moved to the UK from Turkey when he was a teenager and is studying as a student in university. And he's never particularly been interested in sport, never enjoyed it at school, and yet was able to, shortly before the pandemic, enjoy some sessions with a personal trainer who he felt made activity fun. But that was obviously curtailed by the pandemic, and he's returned to a more inactive lifestyle in the 18 months since. The second typology who suffer from motivation, from low motivation levels, are those who simply lack energy to do activity. They're typically feeling tired and drained due to physical jobs, working long hours, or looking after young children, or all of the above. Some of them suggested that they may actually be reaching the weekly guidelines through their daily activity and work, but what they don't feel is positive about activity levels, and they don't have any motivation to do more or to do activity with their children. These residents in our sample tended to be working, male, younger, and parents of young children. Joe is a good example. He used to work in London and commute from Colchester, but since working from home has found that he doesn't have any of the everyday activity that he used to find through his commute. For him, lack of activity can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. He does less, feels more unfit, and it feels even harder to make a start. And just finally, before moving on to the drivers of activity, we also thought that the distinct perspective of those who have limited health and who suffered from long-term health conditions was a really important distinct perspective. They face some of the most prohibitive capability barriers, with activity sometimes being painful or risky if not managed properly, and facilities and opportunities for exercise rarely designed for disabled people with individual needs. And so they felt that they faced quite steep external barriers which were beyond their control. Cost, similarly, played a larger role for these residents than for other participants, with equipment and classes potentially being more expensive. And so these residents tended to be a bit older, and many of them were living alone. Tammy, a wheelchair user living in Basildon, is a good example of this. before she became disabled, she found that her daily routine and commute kept her active, but she's now housebound, doesn't have a ramp fitted up to her front door, and feels that she's unable to use any of the services on offer in her local leisure centre due to the hidden costs associated with it and it being an inappropriately designed space for a wheelchair user. And so it's that lack of motivation which seemed to sit underneath those other barriers, with residents often explicitly saying that they feel they could overcome some of those capability and opportunity barriers if they put their minds to it. So many stated that they felt motivation was the biggest challenge to overcome, which indicated a couple of interesting things that are of importance for the drivers that we'll come to in a moment. Firstly, that a lot of inactive residents are seeing themselves as quite distinct from active people. They see active people as having the right mindset and them not having the right mindset. And we saw again and again when we discussed drivers of activity, a real emphasis on seeing people like me represented in the communications around activity, rather than only seeing active people represented. And secondly, the issue that Lucy alluded to at the very beginning of just getting started. For many, that felt like the biggest first hurdle to overcome, and one that many people struggled to envision. And then finally, within Essex, there were distinct geographical barriers according to the three distinct areas that we conducted research with. So we conducted research with residents of Basildon, Tendring and Colchester. And in our very final workshops with these participants, we got them to draw a map of their local areas and map onto those any opportunities for physical activity. The conversation that happened around those maps in the workshop revealed that there's a real perception among residents in Basildon as the local area being unsafe, and fear that green spaces are being maybe at risk of being developed. Whereas in Tendring, the barriers are far more linked to accessibility, with residents feeling they needed a car in order to access their local areas. Colchester residents, by contrast, were far more positive, with cost being one of the issues, but feeling that largely they did have the resources and the facilities out there as long as they can afford it. So I'm just going to finish before handing back to Lucy by looking at some potential drivers of behaviour change. We tested a real range of messages and prompts to reconsider activity across the final 2 phases of fieldwork. And it was clear that the best ideas made activity feel inclusive and achievable, and positioned the core benefits as being social rather than physical. So we'll talk through that in a bit more detail. But on this slide, you can see that those activities that worked less, those prompts and messages which worked less well, were those which restated the health or the mental health benefits of activity, or those that asked participants to set personal goals which may feel unachievable. Those which worked really well, on the other hand, were those which made activity a social thing, reframed pre-existing hobbies as activity, and gave a social purpose to activity, whether that's a sort of philanthropic or a community-based purpose. And to start with sociability, we tested a couple of prompts and some campaign messages across the 2 phases of fieldwork, which you can see on the left. And across those, the idea of doing activity with others was repeatedly described as a key motivator for this audience. That was because it was seen to help overcome that barrier of just getting started that we've seen as being really important. It made inactive residents feel more likely to stick to their plans, help them take their minds off physical activity, and boosted their confidence, as well as helping issues related to loneliness or isolation. And residents really wanted to see social media used to match local residents who might be interested in the same sort of activity, which they felt wasn't yet out there for inactive residents. and a wider offering of low cost, low impact and community-led activity groups that were suitable for beginners, not just for those who are active already. Very closely linked to this, linked to the importance of the sociability of activity, is the idea of getting children active along with their parents. And that was seen as particularly motivational because it encouraged parents to set a healthy example for their children. It gave them the motivation of being able to keep up with their kids and be more active, especially outdoors, as well as ensuring their continued good health in the long term, ensuring that they stayed healthy for the sake of their kids as they grew up. What we did find was that those messages related to parenting and children, there's always already quite a crowded space there, and the residents felt there's already a lot of targeted advertising towards children, so they wanted to make sure that they weren't necessarily overloaded with advertising targeted at families. And to come to the next idea that tested really well with inactive residents was the idea of doing physical activity with others in the community to make it feel fun, feel good, and accessible. We were conducting our final phase of fieldwork as the ending of lockdown restrictions was on the horizon, and residents saw that as a particularly good moment for getting them out of the house. They wanted to be more active, not simply for its own sake, but also as a byproduct of attending community events, feeling that that could be a good way to disguise or sell exercise, as well as to build local communities. They wanted to see a particular focus on fun and bringing communities together rather than necessarily focusing explicitly on being active or getting fit, as those could typically be seen as off-putting. There was very much a desire for events to be accessible and welcoming, and there were some suggestions related to kind of community fairs, traditional games, which were seen to be lacking in local areas. The final set of ideas that tested really well were those that related to finding the right starting point and building from there. This typically made activity seem unintimidating and inclusive, and messages that we tested, such as find what works for you, explicitly acknowledge that sense that everyone has a different starting point and needs a different form of help. What residents particularly want to see with this is a really empathetic tone, which recognizes that there's going to be a journey that residents need to go on, and advice and guidance on what those first steps could and should be. And to finish with just two ideas that we found didn't work so well with inactive residents. Firstly, they didn't really want to be reminded of the health benefits of activity, just telling us that it prompted guilt rather than action. So inactive residents generally feel that they've already got a good understanding of why they should be doing physical activity. They're aware of the positive impacts on your physical and mental health, but that when combined with underlying low motivation and guilt, that message can actually have a demotivating impact and risks showing a real lack of understanding of the barriers that inactive residents face, with some describing those messages as patronizing. And finally, any ideas which were seen as overly ambitious or intimidating for residents with low starting points were automatically sort of shied away from by this audience. Those which didn't acknowledge how difficult it might be to get back into activity compared to those who are already active, or any ideas which felt ambitious or out of reach, particularly that related to strict goals that you had to set and stick to, could actually push residents further away rather than encourage behavior change. The idea of perhaps making an agreement with a friend was an example of when setting a goal can be seen as flexible and encouraging, but setting personal goals or building activity into your daily routine already feels like quite an intimidating start point for this audience. I'm going to hand back to Lucy to run through some concluding thoughts.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so here's a reprisal of the key findings. I'm not going to go through these in sort of word by word detail, but just as a recap. So the first point is that thinking about physical activity is quite an emotional subject for people who are currently inactive, and they're looking very much for an easy, low impact social way in to starting activity. Secondly, yes, opportunity and capability barriers are important and are typically kind of the top of mind barriers when we're talking to participants about activity, but underlying both of those and what emerged as much more important was lack of motivation. So that was the key barrier across the piece. Having said that, we were able to pull out sort of 5 typologies, groups of people in terms of the key barriers that were affecting them, and they were split across the different kind of combi barriers, so included opportunity, capability and motivation as well. And then finally, just reflecting on the final section there that Tom presented, the things that are most likely to drive behaviour change are messages and prompts that make activity feel enjoyable, inclusive and achievable. So those 3 key elements are absolutely key to engaging and inspiring this particular group of Essex residents. And so moving on then to sort of thinking, okay, what are some of the implications here? The first is that, as we've described, there are a lot of different barriers that people experience, and there isn't really a silver bullet here. That may not be a surprise. It means there's quite a lot of hard work to be done in terms of developing a multi-pronged approach, and making sure that messaging is inclusive, and speaks to lots of different types of barrier across the piece. And then secondly, there is clearly a role for kind of group sessions, things that are run that people can sign up to and join, but we would say it's also important to encourage people to find ways to build activity into their own lives, into their own kind of routines, things like buddy schemes, for example, and a combination of both of those things is what's going to work overall. In terms of those sessions, it needs to be sociable, affordable, welcoming and inclusive of parents with young children. Those are really kind of key elements. But because people are busy and they're telling us they would struggle to sort of fit in new things into their routine, this also points to the need to kind of ways to kind of do it yourself in your own lives, in your own time, without sort of having to sign up to something. And then finally, there is evidence to suggest that tying messaging into the end of lockdown is likely to be helpful. It doesn't need to be explicit, but there's certainly sort of a little bit of energy and motivation around kind of coming out of lockdown. People want to be socializing, they want to be kind of getting out there and trying something new after being cooped up for so long, and there's potentially space to kind of to reflect that desire in any messaging. Whether or not they're sort of they're necessarily thinking at the moment, oh, I have a resolution to be more active, certainly there's a kind of an opportunity to speak to that and kind of to tap into it. And then so the kind of the things that were permitted in lockdown, running and cycling, they to a degree require some internal motivation, but social while social activities can help provide collective motivation and encouragement as we're kind of as we're moving out of lockdown and able to meet up and spend time with others. So that's some final implications there. Very interested to hear any kind of thoughts or comments as we were going through, or indeed any questions that came up as we were presenting. I did see one question that I actually answered in the Q&A function, which was about whether parent-child classes would work, and I just responded to say that that we think that could be a great idea. Certainly, dialing up the sociable side of activity, making sure that it's fun, and this idea actually that you're doing it for the good of somebody else. especially children, was a really key motivator. In fact, that could be extended slightly to sort of to inactive or socially isolated neighbours. So some people talk about, you know, perhaps buddying with an older neighbour who had, you know, sort of been quite isolated over lockdown, and, you know, agreeing to kind of go on a walk with them for once a week, sort of, you know, for the good of that person in a sense, but it would also obviously be, you know, something that you know, that you would be doing as well. So quite an interesting sort of psychological element to it, you know, and you think, you know, this idea of helping somebody else out was quite useful.
We've had a question in the chat, which I could speak to as well, which was whether participants were aware of what physical activity as a definition means. And I think that's a really interesting one, which speaks to a couple of different elements throughout the research. So firstly, they are often thinking of activity in terms of quite strenuous, quite challenging exercise, which can make the prospect of getting started seem intimidating. They may be overlooking elements of physical activity such as gardening or playing with children, and as a result focusing purely on the types of activity that can feel most intimidating if you're someone who is starting from a low starting point. So we did have moments early on in the research where people were reconsidering some elements of their daily lives and wondering if they could perhaps walk more and use that as their way of hitting the guidelines. But then I think the second part of that was really interesting as well was the type of language which participants reacted well to. And when we were testing our messages at the very end of the project, that phrase physical activity actually did feel like quite a positive phrase in terms of it didn't evoke images of fitness enthusiasts or gym bunnies in the way that the words exercise and get fit and those sorts of phrases did. So yeah, definitely something that interesting me about the way in which the language is used when communicating with this audience, as well as potentially encouraging some people, as the question suggests, to reconsider what actually counts as physical activity as well.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the point you made when you were presenting, Tom, about it. There's a bit of a them and us mindset. It's sort of that, you know, there's these active people who have a certain mindset and a certain type of body or a certain type of attitude, and I'm not that person. I'm not that type of person, and we're two very different. You know, it's very the distinction, the difference between being active or inactive feels very big in people's minds. And actually, anything that can be done to sort of to make them realize that, yeah, they're actually doing quite a bit of activity sometimes in their lives, and that can in itself just boost a little bit of confidence. Say, actually, I'm not starting from scratch. I'm already, I'm actually walking to school every day, and if I just did a little bit more, I would be hitting the 150 minutes. And that just, you know, that's really encouraging in itself. It's not like I have to aim to be something completely different from, you know, who I am right now. There are some other questions in the Q&A coming thick and fast now. Did you obtain any findings specifically related to digital solutions for encouraging strength and balance training or activity in general, i.e. use of iPads, that kind of thing? We did we did a series of extension workshops, and we looked at some of the campaign content relating to YouTube videos and that kind of thing. Tom, I don't know if you want to maybe speak to those and how they tested. There was a bit of interest in those, I think.
Yeah, we did less of a kind of specific deep dive on any of the like usability of these things. So it was, most of these findings were kind of obtained perhaps like tangentially rather than focused on it specifically. But typically we talked and heard about the use of Fitbits and also kind of free online YouTube channels, including some that we showed participants that Active Essex offers. And there was quite I think a mixed response to those, depending on the extent to which they felt tailored sort of to them. When it came to the YouTube channels, they were quite positive about the different ranges of activity represented on there. But what those kind of YouTube tutorials don't really speak to is the social ways of doing exercise, and they wanted to see some kind of more modeling of this is a club that you can join where you're getting the social side of things as well as the activity side of things. Quite a lot of the tutorials were quite focused on workouts rather than some of those more disguised forms of activity that really spoke to this audience.
Yeah, it's possible that they might be of more interest to people who are a little bit further down that journey, who have kind of who have started becoming a bit more active, they've built their confidence, and then can connect a bit more, or find the idea of doing it for physical health reasons or mental health reasons a bit more encouraging. But where people are, the people in our sample we're currently at, the physical and mental health benefits weren't the key motivating drivers, which is where the sort of the YouTube exercise class in your own front room kind of thing kind of fits in a bit more, I would say. Just a quick question, about how we recruited our research participants. So we basically work with professional market research recruiters. We have kind of grassroots recruiters working all across the UK, and so we work with Essex-based recruiters to find our participants. We work with the client team to draft up recruitment screeners, so we're asking questions that make sure we're ticking off the right demographics and making sure we're speaking to the right people. And they use a range of kind of methods. They've got sort of databases to start with, and they have their own kind of contacts, and they will go out to the people that they know and snowball from those initial contacts to find us the people that we need to speak to for the project. So that's how we did the recruitment.
Worth saying for this one as well, I think that we built in the Sport England's golden questions to make sure that everyone in our sample was inactive according to Sport England's definition, which I know is kind of the sort of shared definition in the sector.
Yeah, really good point. Thanks, Tom. And then just a sort of a comment here, isn't it also about educating youngsters that an active lifestyle doesn't stop when you leave school, get a job, have a family, etc.? Difficult as it's not a one size fits all scenario, but then a recognition there's a push to get girls more active in secondary school. I think that's a really important part of the puzzle. I mean, we were talking to people, there were some younger people in the sample, but we were talking to people who were kind of reflecting on their school years and had often had quite a negative experience, had kind of squarely, from that experience, squarely put themselves in a non-sporty kind of box, and perhaps, may have been forced to do PE at school, but then it's fallen out of their lives since they've left education, and their lives are filled up with lots of other things. So I think it's not just a case of kind of making a case that you continue activity, but also making sports and activity in school as inclusive and as fun, and doesn't sort of label people as non-sporty types at that young age, because we could see in our sample that those kind of that self-perception lasted many decades actually, to where we were speaking with them. I don't know if you've got anything else to add on that, Tom.
Nothing on that one. I was just looking at one of the final questions. I know we've got a couple of minutes left, which was around the shift to home working and hybrid working, and the evidence from our research on whether that's a barrier to people being more or less active. We worked at the early stage of the design of this project with some academics at the University of Essex who'd and it was referenced on one of our slides, found that that lockdown had led to people who were already active probably being a bit more active, and those who were inactive being even less so. And I think that was really borne out in our qualitative research as well, in that we heard from quite a few of our participants who were working from home, and it's worth saying that that wasn't the case for all who were in work, that some were still out and about doing their jobs in a non-office setting. But those who were working from home described having lost that sort of everyday form of activity through not having to commute anymore, and no longer having the routine, or perhaps also the impact of the lockdown on simply their motivation to get out of the house and kind of make that first start. So yeah, I think our qualitative evidence really supported that quantitative research as well, in suggesting that for inactive residents in particular, this shift towards home working may well, or certainly the lockdown itself may well make it seem a harder barrier to overcome rather than make it seem easier.
Yeah, great. There's just one final question. Do I have time for it, Courtney? You which is just what's next for participants. So just to say that our participants have been thanked for their time. You know, we pay an incentive to thank everybody for their involvement in the research, and we've closed the project with them now. So in fact, there's no sort of future activity or research planned with them, but I think we have permission to recontact if there is any interest in sort of following people a little bit further down the line. But for the time being, their work is done, and we've thanked them for their contributions.
Amazing. Thank you to Tom and Lucy for delivering that really insightful presentation. It's really interesting to see the research and the feedback from Essex residents. So thank you everyone for joining this webinar. Just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded, so you can access it on our Active Essex YouTube channel. So feel free to pass that on to colleagues or partners as well. If you didn't have a chance to ask a question, then feel free to email the Active Essex email address that sent out the joining details, and we can pass on those questions to Tom or Lucy or any of our team members to be able to answer. But just a final thank you from us.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.